So back to part 3 of the ethics. Seems to have been all over the place since I started on this, but I think I'm going to go at a fairly rapid rate through part 3. I just want to do a bit of background before I get into propositions 12 and 13, which essentially say that our minds will always tune in to what gives us power. And if there's something in our minds that diminishes our power, we will try and find some way to get rid of it. So let me go through some background just to set the scene. So in part 3 so far, if you've listened to the previous podcast, you will know that the essence of a person is the desire to persist in existence. This is what drives everything. That's neither a good nor bad thing, it's just the way it is. And in Spinoza's terminology, it's worth bearing in mind that perfection equals reality equals power. So whenever he talks about perfection or reality, he's talking about power, the power to exist. Let me just mention at this point, there is an attachment below, PDF of the propositions that I'm going to go through, so download that if you want to look at it at the same time. Anyway, so the essence of a person is the desire to persist. Some people call it the survival instinct. It's a little bit more than that. It's to be what you are. Because normally we are not what we really are, because we're influenced by external things and events. So we might behave in a certain way that is foreign to our nature just to please everybody else. So we are not persisting in our existence at that point. We are basically just a thing responding to the environment. Anyway, so we are always seeking greater power of existence. This is the very core of us. It's the launch point for a great deal of Spinoza's analysis of the human situation. This desire for persisting in existence is there in every living creature, and it causes problems because we all strive to gain this power, very often at the expense of other creatures or other people. So in part 3, Spinoza is kind of giving a profile of hell, the inevitable outcome of all of this, and in fact proposition 55 is where he summarizes the whole thing. And then we talk about pleasure and pain. Pleasure is an increase in power. It's the actual increase. If you've got $1 million, then sooner or later $1 million will not give you pleasure. You'll want 10 million. So it's the increase that matters. And pain is a decrease in power, and it's always associated with some external thing. So we always associate some external thing as giving us the pleasure or the pain. So pain is a decrease in power. If you've got $10 million and you lose 9 and you've got 1, then that will cause you some pain. And when Spinoza talks about the body's power of activity, he's literally just talking about the power for existence. If your body has no power, then basically it's going to die. If it's malnourished or can't move or whatever, then you've got problems. So let me go through proposition 12. He says the mind, as far as it can, endeavours to think of those things that increase or assist the body's power of activity. So our minds will tune in to thoughts that enhance our existence quite naturally. It doesn't mean that we'll get those things. So people might daydream about winning the lottery because that gives them a lot more power in life, or they might dream of being the ultimately attractive sexual partner, because the sex drive is a large part of this power for existence. And the mind's always thinking about those things, so the mind, as far as it can, endeavours to think of those things that increase or assist the body's power of activity. And I've mentioned in one of the previous podcasts the practice of just sitting and observing your desires as they arise. Those desires are always about wanting some power somehow. to try and impress people, to get a promotion. This is what we're always, these are the desires that are always arising within us. And they're always about getting more power, and our mind naturally thinks about those things all the time. It doesn't want to think about things that negate its power. So the mind, as far as it can, endeavours to think of those things that increase or assist the body's power of activity. Now, the proof sort of wanders off a little bit, but it's actually fairly important, and if you get the time, look at Proposition 17 in Part 2, because it elaborates on this. As long as the human body is affected in a manner that involves the nature of an external body, so long will the human mind regard that latter body as present. Consequently, as long as the human mind regards some external body as present, that is, thinks of it, very important, we only recognize something as being present when it's when it's in our consciousness, basically, or when we have an idea of it, to be more precise. So long is the human body affected in a manner that involves the nature of that external body. Accordingly, as long as the mind thinks of those things that increase or assist our body's power of activity, so long is the body affected in ways that increase or assist its power of activity. So, this is where the positive thinking fallacy sort of comes in. So you can think of winning the lottery and what you're going to do with it, the nice house, the nice car, the best healthcare, the best education for your kids, and so on and so forth. And that might sort of empower you a little bit, but the problem is it's probably not going to happen. So the downside is that you then have the decrease of power that then is associated with coming down the other side of the hill. I mean, if you win the lottery, then fine, you can get all those things, but even that, this is the roller coaster of pleasure and pain, the increases and the decreases. So even if you win the lottery, at some point you will become bored with it. But anyway, the important thing here is that the mind naturally homes into those things that give it power, and particularly or specifically give the body power. So we think about winning the lottery, getting a promotion at work, a very nice meal, anything that reinforces the body, gives it more power for existence. So those are the things we think about all the time. And with each of those desires or thoughts is an ambition. So Spinoza is talking about it here in a very analytical manner, but the implications of it are fairly, what's the word? Well, they're important, because it can lead to all kinds of problems. So as long as the mind thinks of those things that increase or assist our body's power of activity, so long is the body affected in ways that increase or assist its power of activity, and consequently, so long is the mind's power of thinking increased or assisted. Therefore, the mind, insofar as it can, endeavours to think of those things. It's our natural tendency, all the time, to be thinking of ways to increase our power in life. It's an inadequate thing, very often, or usually, because we're normally thinking of something external, and because of that, the ideas associated with that are inadequate, because actually we don't know anything other than how we're feeling and what thoughts we have. All our thoughts of, well, if I get this nice big Mercedes, I'm going to be more important. You don't know whether that's the case or not. You don't know whether people are going to look at you, or it's all imagination. Anyway, so that's our natural tendency, to try and increase our power by thinking about things that give us power. And then Proposition 13 is kind of the inverse of that. He says, when the mind thinks of those things that diminish or check the body's power of activity, it endeavours as far as it can to call to mind those things that exclude the existence of the former. So, let's say, I'll read that again and just go through it a little bit more slowly. When the mind thinks of those things that diminish or check the body's power of activity. Well, what could diminish or check your body's power of activity? Well, possibly your partner leaving. Maybe you have a stormy relationship and they might leave. Or maybe you might lose your job at work. So these things would diminish your power of activity. If you haven't got any money, then your survival prospects are reduced a little bit. Same as if you haven't got a partner, then they're reduced a little bit as well, because you haven't got any support around you. So those things would check the body's power of activity, but we endeavour as far as we can to call to mind those things that exclude the existence of the former. So if, for example, we're having financial difficulties, what do? We sit there and we think about how we can address them. Oh, I need to spend less. Oh, I need to earn more. We start thinking about the ways to negate that situation that threatens us, shortage of money. So we're always, if there's something threatening us in some kind of way, we're always thinking of, or quite automatically thinking about how we can solve that, to bring to mind something that negates the potentially negative situation we might be in. So as long as the mind thinks of something of this kind, so long is the power of mind and body diminished or checked. Nevertheless, mind will continue to think of it until it thinks of another thing that excludes the present existence of the former. That is, the power of mind and body is diminished or checked until the mind thinks of something else that excludes the thing's existence. Something which the mind therefore endeavours as far as it can to think of or call to mind. This is probably a good explanation for worrying. If you have financial difficulties, the worrying is essentially an attempt to try and find some solution to it, to negate the thoughts of not having enough money to pay the rent or whatever. So the mind's always doing that. The mind is always seeking power, which is automatic and in some ways is problematical. But anyway, that's another thing. So the corollary says, hence it follows that the mind is averse to thinking of things that diminish or check its power and the body's power. From what has been said, we clearly understand what are love and hatred. Love is merely pleasure accompanied by the idea of an external cause, and hatred is merely pain accompanied by the idea of an external cause. Again, we see that he who loves necessarily endeavours to have present and preserve the thing that he loves. On the other hand, he who hates endeavours to remove and destroy the thing that he hates. But we shall deal with these matters more fully in due course. So we're always pursuing the things that give us pleasure, and always attempting to remove or destroy the things that give us pain. It's just the way we work. This is the whole of the human situation, and it isn't really just human. Animals behave in that way as well. Anyway, I want to finish on proposition 36, which is quite a jump. I'm not going to jump straight away to 36, after the next podcast, but in the next podcast. But it's a very good example here of what all of this means. And I'll go through it first, and then I'll be able to give you a very good example, a conversation I had with a woman once. He who recalls a thing which once afforded him pleasure desires to possess the same thing in the same circumstances as when he first took pleasure therein. So he who recalls a thing which once afforded him pleasure desires to possess the same thing in the same circumstances as when he first took pleasure therein. So a very good example of this is you see people sometimes who get older, maybe they're in their 50s or 60s or even older, and they try to dress like teenagers. They might wear tight jeans. It doesn't always look very good, but that's the kind of thing they do. You see middle-aged men with open shirts, displaying their chests, medallion men. You see middle-aged and older women trying to display a cleavage or wearing tight jeans, and it just doesn't look very good. What they're trying to do is recreate a time when they had more power. And clearly what that is telling you is that the time that they had most power was when they were possibly in their teens or maybe 20s. They had clearly what they perceive anyway to be sexual power at that age. And for both men and women, it gives them a lot of pleasure. So they're trying to recreate it. So, a 50 or 60-year-old person could pursue sexual pleasures. They don't have to wear tight jeans and all the rest of it. But they're looking for the same environment, the same circumstances, as Spinoza calls it. Anyway, the conversation I had with this woman sort of went like this. We were talking about this, and it rang a real bell for her, because she said her period of greatest power was when her kids were young. She felt completely fulfilled by it. It gave her the most pleasure. And she was having a great deal of difficulty letting them grow up, because she wanted to keep them in that, in that particular situation, as being dependent on her, as her being able to fulfill their needs, which gave her a great deal of pleasure. So we all do it in some way or other. I've done it. My period of greatest power prior to maybe the last 10 years, but my greatest period one of my greatest periods of power was when I was at university. I was just shit hot at physics. I got first class honours. I was mixing with the likes of Fred Hoyle and David Deutsch, and it was fucking wonderful. And after I left university, I went to do my PhD in general relativity. I just thought I was the bee's knees. And for many years I tried to recreate that. I just couldn't let go of my general relativity books, much to my ex-wife's annoyance. So we all do it in some way or other, and sometimes it's fairly basic, like old people trying to dress like they're young people, or it's the way that I did it, which was trying to recreate the feeling of, whatever it was, power that I had when I was at university. Anyway, this proposition goes on. Whatever a man has seen together with the object that is afforded him pleasure will be indirectly a cause of pleasure, and so he will desire to possess all this together with the object that afforded him pleasure. That is, he will desire to possess the object along with all the same attendant circumstances as when he first took pleasure in the object. If therefore he finds one of those attendant circumstances missing, the lover will feel pain. How many married people try to reconstruct in some way or other their first meeting, and it's never successful because everything has changed and they can't duplicate the events. Insofar as he finds some attendant circumstance missing, to that extent he imagines something that excludes its existence. Now, since he desires that thing or circumstance by reason of his love, then insofar as he thinks it to be lacking, he will feel pain. This pain, insofar as it regards the absence of that which we love, is called longing. And I know some people who, in I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years ago, sort of went through a halcyon period, and their minds are just fixed on there, and they're melancholy and they're longing, because their life now, for whatever reason, has far less power. You find this with people who retire, particularly executives who run companies. They had a lot of power, then all of a sudden they have none, and they're trying to recreate it in some silly way, and it usually comes out through boasting in social events. So this is the human condition, always seeking power, always trying to recreate situations where we had power, avoiding thoughts and situations that would diminish our power, and thinking of things and situations that would enhance our power. We're little power robots. Of course, what Spinoza's talking about here in the main is inadequate things, things that involve external objects or events or people or whatever. Anyway, there will be more on part 3, and it should be fun.